Okay, so welcome to Common Mistakes in Accessibility and Design and Construction. My name is Marcella Rhodes, and I'm a registered accessibility specialist, and have the pleasure of working with you guys on several of your projects in Texas. And I am also a registered architect, and so I've been, doing this for about 17 years, and so I'm pretty excited to be here to kind of shed some light on some of the things that I see that have commonly, been mistakes in the during design and construction for accessibility. And this does cover 1 hour of HSW barrier free. So if you're needing that credit for your license, please let me know. And I'm assuming, like you told me, there's going to be someone sending me a list of who's here, what your AIA numbers are, if you need a certificate, etc. And I'll report your hours for you, and I'll send you a certificate if you need it for your license. All right, very good. So one second, let me get to my controls. The learning objectives, I'm going to be, showing you some violations that I find as an inspector, and some drawings mistakes that I also find, and some technical standards that I'm going to go over that are misunderstood, and maybe how to correct some of the errors. Okay, the first common error that I see is that there's a misunderstanding of the standards, and I'm going to give you a few examples of that. Before I start, I didn't really give you an overview of the standards, but basically, I'm going to be talking about the ADA, with the Americans with Disabilities Act, which was a law that was against discrimination of people with disabilities. It was a civil rights law that the federal government and it passed in 1990, and in 1991 they published standards for architects and designers to figure out how to make their buildings accessible. Then later on, they actually revised that standard and created a new one, or created more of a comprehensive one basically in 2010. They called it the 2010 ADA Standards for Accessible Design, and it passed into law then, and was published in 2012. It was published in 2010, but it became mandatory in 2012. In Texas, we have a law in our Texas government code that says that we have to have our own standards. And I'm sure other states do the same thing. So you have to be careful where you're designing and what standards you have to follow. But lucky for you, Texas adopted the ADA and just renamed it. So essentially, the Texas Accessibility Standards.
Say to the accessibility.
And if you can mute yourselves, that would be great. Everybody mute yourselves. So basically, the Texas Accessibility Standards and the ADA are exactly the same. One second, I'm going to mute whoever's there. I'm hearing people talking. So, okay, but essentially, they're the same exact standard. There are a few things in the scoping of the Texas Accessibility Standards that are a little bit different than ADA, but they're essentially the same. And I'll let you know when there's a little bit of a difference. So what you're learning today is basically the ADA and TAS together, okay? So there were some changes from the original ADA and original TAS. And by the way, the TAS also, the Texas Accessibility Standards also changed in 2012. So they're both about the same time. One's called the 2012 Texas Accessibility Standards, and the other one's called 2010 ADA, but they're essentially the same technical standard. So in the old standard, both ADA and TAS, there was a side reach, for example. I'm going to give you one of my examples, is that there was a side reach that was allowed to be 54 inches high. And they changed it to 48 inches. So now there's a lot of contractors that, and then maybe there's a lot of designers too, that still have the old standards, their typical details have certain things, and they misunderstand that changed So it's no longer allowed to be 54 inches high. Now it has to be 48 inches. One of the things that is not understood is that if you have existing buildings that were built before the change in standard, so say before 2012, and they had existing conditions that were at 54 inches high, for example, that was considered a safe harbor. Man, they don't like the word grandfathered, but it's essentially that's what it means. If you have an existing condition that meets the old standard, they basically is compliant with the new standard. So it's easy for the reach ranges, that's easy, right? Because that doesn't, you can just lower it if you need to. What's nice about the safe harbor is that it also applies to existing toilet rooms that were designed in the old standard. The old standard allowed you to have 36 inches from the side wall of your toilet to an obstruction, which is the lavatory with an e-space. And now the new standard needs you to have 5 feet clear at the water closet. So if you have an existing restroom that was built before 2012, that looks like the picture on the left, it's compliant. So I'm not going to tell you that everything's compliant, but the clearance, if the clearance is 36 inches, it's compliant. So you don't have to worry about changing it to, if you have an existing condition that meets the old standard in every way, then it's considered a safe harbor or grandfathered, but they don't use that. So safe harbor. Safe harbor is what it's called. Some things, for example, are misunderstood is the rear wall grab bar was never located in relationship to the wall. I get a lot of contractors and designers that measure the rear wall grab bar 6 inches from the wall to the edge. And neither of the standards, the old one or the new one, has it drawn that way or tells you to do it that way. I believe this is an ANSI standard that people are getting confused about. So you have to also understand that besides the ADA, and each state has their own, the building code has another design standard, which is called the ANSI A117.1. And unfortunately, even though they're very similar, there's a lot of little differences. And I'm not going to cover ANSI today, but just so you know, the ADA and TOS require that you locate the rear wall grab bar based on the location of the toilet. So you take the center line of the toilet and then you go 12 inches on one side minimum and 24 inches on the other side minimum. So for altogether, you have to have a 36-inch grab bar. 24 inches is not allowed, even though that's what it was understood when you saw the old graphic. It showed you a 24-inch long grab bar, but not really. It showed you the 24-inch grab bar and where the wall was, then you went 12 inches one way or 12 inches the other way, but it was a misunderstood standard. So that's why they redrew the figure. So the standard didn't change, the figure got clearer. So now you can see in the new figure, it shows you where the wall is and in relationship to where the toilet is, etc. So that's how you design. So make sure that your details are dimensioning it or noting it correctly. Okay, another thing that we want to avoid is we want to understand why the standards were written the way they were written. Okay, so there's a standard that says that gaps or openings along the accessible route cannot be larger than ½ an inch. And there's a lot of times when we don't understand why that is, but it's because a wheelchair wheel, a caster, will get stuck in the gap that's wider. So we also, when we look at the graphic, the ADA and TOS give you a grate as your graphic or as your figure. And so we think that's the only time that we have to worry about it is when we have grates. But it doesn't say grates. It says elongated openings in the floor or ground surface. So really anything that creates an opening along your accessible route will be needed to be no more than ½ an inch wide. So for example, an expansion joint, let's say you have an expansion joint either with sealant or with maybe a cedar or wood, and it rots away, then there's a larger gap. But what if you have a sealant, it's brand new construction and they put sealant, but the gap is wider, but the sealant is lower than 1/4 of an inch, which is allowed as a change in level. So that's going to be a violation. So you want to make sure that you don't have any gaps, even on pavers as well. So gaps larger than 1/2 inch will require a change in level no more than 1/4 of an inch. So that's one thing that you can do. Another thing that is, misunderstood is why we have door maneuvering clearances. So if you go to the figure under the door maneuvering, you have a rectangle that's dashed around the door or in front of the door. Depending on how you approach the door, you're going to have a certain amount of additional space to maneuver, meaning to reach the door handle, open the door, and go through the door. So I'm showing you my friend Carrie, who's my model for a lot of these things. He's needing to reach the door handle, and as you can see, his feet have to have a certain amount of space to reach that door handle. So that's what's considered a maneuvering clearance. All that, it has to be unobstructed. So your approach to the door will dictate how much space you're going to need to provide around the door. So in this case, you have a pull side forward approach. So you'll see the letter A of your figures shows you a rectangle that's 60 inches in depth and have 18 inches minimum on the pull side. So that's basically your maneuvering clearance that you're required to have if you're approaching the door in a forward approach for a pull side. On a push side, for example, you'll have on a push side, you'll have 48 inches instead of 60, and there's no additional space next to the door on the push side, unless, and this what gets confusing, unless you have both a closer and a latch. So letter B shows you a push side door that has either a closer or a latch, and letter C shows you both a door on a push side with both a closer and a latch. If you see the little fine print. So what does that mean? In this case, you're going to need an additional 12 inches on the push side. So this is only on the push side. The pull side, you still need 18, regardless of whether you have door closers or latches. It doesn't matter. Only on the push side does it matter. I mean, in these two conditions. There's other conditions that will require you, and so you have to read the little figure to see if it meets your condition. So if you have a closer and a latch both, then you need an additional 12 inches on the push side. So that's one thing. Sorry. Okay. So drinking fountains, and this one happens in your CSL projects, and I'm gonna focus on this because I've seen it several times already. So in a building, each level has to have a minimum of 2 drinking fountains. So where drinking fountains are provided on an exterior site, on a floor, or within a secured area, they shall provide a minimum number of 2. So it doesn't have to be next to each other. So this one is a single unit, a single wheelchair drinking fountain, but it happens in the departure lounge of your CSL plasma projects. If your departure lounge is one that once you exit, you may not come back in through that door, it is considered a secured area. So basically you're exiting, you've done giving plasma, and you're exiting into the departure lounge to go out, and you see the drinking fountain and you can use it. If you're not allowed to come back in that way, that same door, then you're supposed to provide me 2 drinking fountains in that area. If you're allowed to come back in, then it doesn't matter, because on that same floor, in the same floor, because it's usually a single floor, then you have a high drinking fountain, and that's the difference. One's for a wheelchair and one's for a standing person. So this one's for a wheelchair, and you already have one for a standing person inside the plasma lobby, the regular lobby. next to the, usually it's near the restrooms. So if that's the case, you're fine. It's fine and you're compliant because they don't have to be next to each other. But if this is the, but if you ever, but if you have an exterior condition, so let's say you have an interior drinking fountain and then you have also an exterior drinking fountain, each area has to have two, the inside and outside. So I don't know if you guys do many like schools, for example, but in the schools, or you have a playground and you have a playground with drinking fountains outside and you have drinking fountains inside, you have to have a minimum of two in each area. So that's something to keep in mind when you're designing. Okay. One of the biggest things that I see is when we design for using maximums and minimums. So I'm going to recommend do not use maximums and minimums. The construction is not a perfect science. And if I'm giving you, if you say that the maneuvering clearance for a door is 18 inches minimum and you design it for 18 inches, you're inevitably going to get it wrong. I mean, not you, but your contractor is probably not going to get it right because there's no fluff factor. There's no room for error, basically. So this is what happened in this case. This is a door maneuvering clearance, and they brought me out before the construction was finished because they wanted to check things like this. And so I measured it, and from the door clearance, and I measure it to the door, okay, to the edge of the door. So it's not to the edge of the frame because the frame is technically part of the wall. So I'm gonna measure it to the door, to where the door opening is. And you can see that it's a little bit less than, I mean, it's 17 and a little bit, 17 and an eighth maybe, but it's not 18. The 18 is gonna be part of the door now. And that's a mistake. And so they'll argue with me, well, it's only 1 inch, but it's not because there's a word minimum, and that assumes that you're going to make it bigger than that. So this would be incorrect. So when you're designing, just make sure you're not measuring or dimensioning to the minimums and the maximums. Something else that happens is when you have protruding objects. I haven't talked about protruding objects, so let me explain, and I'll talk about it a little bit later. But technically, if you're a blind person and you are walking around the building, you are using a cane to detect your way because you can't see. So what the standards are recommending or they're requiring is that anything that's along a circulation path, in this case, I'm in a conference room and I'm at the door right now. I'm opening the door and the TV is right in front of me. So if I'm walking into the room, that is my circulation path to find my seat at the conference room table. So when I'm not going to be able to see that, my cane can only detect up to 27 inches high. Anything below 27 inches, I can detect it with my walking cane, with my cane detection. And so they say that if you have an object mounted on the wall along a circulation path, which means a pedestrian path for a blind person, not for a wheelchair, that's an accessible route, this is a circulation path, then it can't be more than 4 inches from the wall. So in this case, it was 4 3/4 of an inch. It's still wrong. It's still a protruding object because my minimum was 4 inches. So remember, if you're having just a little bit off, it's still a violation. And if it gives you a maximum or a minimum. Same thing with grab bars. Grab bars, there's a 54-inch that's required from the rear wall to the end of the grab bar. This one happens to be 53 1/4. So it's still incorrect. It's not a proper dimension. And then this one's the one that drives me crazy the most. Counters at a sink has to be 34 inches maximum. And it doesn't tell you that it has to be 34 inches. It can give, I think it even says it can be between 28 and 34 to the top. So you have leeway. So we could dimension it to 33 inches as long as my knee space is proper, And that's another thing. So I'm going to tell you why they do it the way that I've seen it done. They dimension 34 inches and they dimension 27 inches. And those are the maximums and minimums that it can be. So if you have a minimum of 27 inches at the knee clearance and 34 inches maximum at the top of the sink, then there's room there to play with. So don't design it so that your apron or your little, this little apron is right at 27 inches and the top of your sink is at 34. That's going to get you in trouble. So in this case, and I hate to like do this, it's like it's 34 and a half or 34 and 3/4. I'm like, you guys, you could have done it lower. So that's one thing that I'm just going to recommend, is that always design a little bit 1 inch or half an inch lower or higher than it needs to be, and so that you can have some wiggle room when there's construction going on. Okay, like one of the things that I see a lot is,
Marcella,
yes,
I have a question. Going back to the last picture,
yes.
can you talk about the garbage disposal?
I will when I talk about knee clearance.
Okay, that's fine.
Yeah, I'll talk about the knee clearance in a little bit. Yeah, but thank you.
Thank you.
If I don't bring it up, I'm going to write it down. Then I'm going to talk about the disposal, but that's part of the knee clearance, and I'm going to talk about that in a little bit. So yes, remind me if I don't. Okay, so then one of the things that I don't see is I don't see dimensions a lot in door maneuvering clearances, and we can assume like there's 2 changing rooms, and let's not talk about the 50% thing or 5% thing. Let's just focus on the plans. Let's pretend there's just a bathroom or whatever. This is actually looks wide enough. I'm not going to assume that it's more than 18 inches, and I don't scale my drawings, by the way, because that's just, I always look at dimensions. So I'm not going to scale my drawings and tell you that this is right. But I'm going to tell you that I saw this looked pretty good, but I saw this. This gave me a red flag. There's a column there. We don't really know exactly where that column is going to land. I mean, we can try to figure it out by the column grid, and I'm sure that if they're going to build it exactly the way it's drawn, but that's going to get you a little bit less room than this one, because this one doesn't have a column. So this would have been a good place to dimension, because then you want to make sure that it's 18 inches minimum. And if there's a column there, and it might be furred out, and it might be, so this might be something that will give us problems in the field. So so when you have these conditions, just dimension them. This is what happened here. We didn't have enough room. They put also, by the way, who knows what specification. I mean, we're using a symbol from a library. It may or may not be the right depth, or the depth that we're going to get when we finally buy the product, right? So this American Standard lavatory might have been different size than the one you showed in the drawings, and then so you're going by what you're drawing and not what you're really speccing. So be careful with that. Again, I'm going to remind you of like the 18 inches on the pool side, because this is what happened in this case. This condition was interesting. I'm going to show you the plan. This was I have a pool side. There's a sink right here, and I didn't have 18 inches on the pool side. Well, I might have, but I didn't have my 5 feet. There was actually a sink in my way. So I think I had 18 inches eventually. We had 18 inches minimum, but I didn't have my 5 feet. The sink was the lavatory was in the way. So that was a problem that we found in the field. And we also saw that this lavatory was really close to the water closet. So that meant that I couldn't really move it anymore. I could move it maybe 4 inches. That wasn't going to give me the right amount that I needed. I think if you see my I only had 40 inches from the door to the lavatory. And if you factor in the taper, it's 39 and a half. So really I needed 5 feet. So what we decided to do was, the only solution that I could find is that, why don't we swing the door out? And thankfully we had plenty of room for that to happen. So when you when you then, and then we took away the closer, by the way. So we had no closer, which was not always allowed. I mean, you have to check with your building official. Restrooms might need closers. So, and so but it's fine. Even if it had a closer, I think we had enough room. I was trying to keep it to 48 inches plus my 12 inches, which is actually how it worked. It worked out, and they were able to move the lavatory 8 inches without encroaching into the water closet. And so that was a good thing. But yeah, door maneuvering clearances in these conditions are tough to do. Something else that you want to keep in mind is the door maneuvering clearances also apply to your toilet compartment doors, except when you have this exact condition. When you have this condition where you have a side latch approach on a pool side, you're allowed to have 42 inches. You don't have to follow the section 404, except in this condition. Every other condition, you have to look at section 404 to tell you how much space you need. So some of the things that I notice is, so you have an outswinging door in this toilet compartment, but you're gonna need 18 inches on the pool side. And because there's a wall here, you're not gonna be able to get it. So you are allowed to swing the door in, because all you need is 56 inches of clearance at the water closet, plus, and then you can have your opening. So that's what I recommended, that just swing the door in, don't swing it out. And same thing with these kind of conditions. So if you have, in this case, it was not really required to have 36 inches, but this is a hinge side approach. And so you are going to need 36 inches instead of 18. So all they need to do is just rotate the door so that the latch is here instead of here. So that's allowed, because if you notice the wording of a toilet compartment door, it's the opening of the door, they're not telling you where the hinge needs to be. They tell you, hang on, let me see if they have it 4 inches to the opening. If you read this, the figure doesn't tell you, but the text tells you that it needs to be 4 inches from the corner. The opening of the door needs to be 4 inches maximum. So it's not that it's showing you a hinge, but you can always have a latch there. So it's not required to be a hinge. So you have to read when the figure's not clear. You go by what the text tells you. So this is one of your projects where the door's swinging out, and you only have 15.5 inches on the pool side. So you had plenty of room to swing it in. And that's what I told your contractor that they had to do. And usually when I do an inspection, I give you a report, and I'm not going to tell your contractor what to do. And I told him, I'm just giving you a suggestion, but the architect and your owner has to be the one giving you the directive. My report is not a directive. So you guys have to figure out what you want to do. But in this case, the easy solution would be to swing the door in. You had plenty of room inside, and that would have solved the problem. So I think that's what you did anyway. So something to keep that in mind. Something else to think about is when you have existing conditions on a site, sometimes you have a change in level from the grade to your finished floor. And so what people don't understand is that adding a ramp, it doesn't solve the problem. So adding a ramp is good. That's actually what we probably recommend, but not this ramp. This ramp has two problems. The first problem is there's no landing at the top of the ramp, which is required for ramps. So and then the second problem is the door doesn't have a flat maneuvering clearance. So that rectangle that we saw in the fixed section 404 that shows you the maneuvering clearances, that has to be 2% in all directions. The reason is because if I'm going up the ramp and let's say somehow I get on this ramp, because there's hardly any room to do that, and I reach the door handle, which is really high, by the way. So, and then I try to somehow open the door. Once I let go of the door, I'm going to roll down the ramp. So you really need a wheelchair. A person in a wheelchair has to have an area where they land, where they arrive at the door, so that they don't roll down when they try to open the door. So this wouldn't have been. So the only way to fix this is to re-pour the ramp where you have a landing, and then maybe you go parallel to the building instead of perpendicular to the building. Okay, so then remember, the rectangles that they're shown in this figure has to be 2% in all directions. Something else that it's misunderstood is protruding objects are, again, the things that I told you about. A person who's blind cannot detect anything that's above 27 inches. In this case, that trash receptacle is below 27 inches, so it's not a protruding object. So that's not an issue. But now we're seeing that it's basically in the maneuvering clearance of the door, but that's allowed. And let's see if I did this. Yeah. So there is a section in 404 that tells you if you have any obstruction inside the 18 inches, as long as it's not more than 8 inches deep, you can count it as part of your maneuvering clearance. So if you take a look at this is probably around 4 inches or 6 inches. Let's pretend it's 6 inches. Okay, but some trash receptacles are bigger, but in this case, it was about 6 inches. If it's less than 8 inches, you can count this as part of your wall for maneuvering. So it's basically, if I'm reaching for that door handle, that trash receptacle is not really in my way. It is allowed to be recessed that much. So that's where it's either a wall sticker or you have a receptacle next to it or something that's an obstruction within that 18 inches or 12 inches. So you're allowed to do that. So there's my wonderful friend Carrie showing you why we need that 18 inches, right? So we have the amount of space you need for the feet, then you need 5 feet minimum for him to get to open the door all the way and get through the door. So that's why you need all that space. And it has to be flat so that he doesn't roll down if he's doing all that maneuvering. Okay. Another thing that's confusing and that people don't misunderstand is work areas. So there are some exceptions of what is required to comply with the standards. Work areas are exempted, but in a limited way. So just because you have areas that are public and areas that are for workers, that doesn't mean that all the areas that are for workers are exempted. So the only thing that's required for a true work area where people are working is approach, enter, and exit. So my little figure is showing you the maneuvering clearance is at the door, and the door hardware and the door changes in level. All that has to comply for a work area door. In other words, a door that leads you into the work area. And it doesn't mean that once I'm inside the work area, every door has to comply, just the door to enter the work area. So, and of course, if there's multiple work areas, each door to those areas. I'm not talking about the suite of offices or rooms inside that area, just the main door to get into the work area. But what is a work area and what's not a work area is what gets people confused. So, the ones in yellow are the work areas. But if you notice that restroom, okay, this is actually a retail store, but it works, in general. I have an office there and there's that restroom, and that's not in yellow. Even though it's a staff restroom, it's not in yellow. Why? Because only work-related areas are exempted. The ones that, so for example, a janitor's closet is a work area for the janitor. So that the room itself is exempted, the door into it is not. If you have commercial kitchens, the inside of the commercial kitchen is exempted. So none of these things have to comply, and there's no requirement for heights or knee clearance, et cetera, for a kitchen. But lockers, there's kind of a locker. Lockers are either for personal use, or most of the time they're for personal use. And so if they're for personal use, like I'm working here in the CSL plasma and I have to put my belongings away. I'm the staff person. I have to put my belongings away so I can get to work. This locker is not considered part of your work-related activity. Therefore, it has to comply. So 5% of your lockers have to have the type of hardware that doesn't require tight grasping and twisting of the wrist to operate. So that's lockers are not exempted, and break rooms are not exempted. So you have to have a knee clearance at the sink. You have to have the proper heights, the proper faucets, etc. So employee break rooms are not considered work areas. Okay, so here's what. Oh, and then of course, like we talked about, the staff restrooms are also not work related, and therefore they're not exempted and they have to comply. All right, let's talk about knee and toe clearances. So one of the things that are misunderstood is what are the requirements for knee and toe clearances under sinks, under drinking fountains, under work surfaces, etc. So they have, again, the minimums and the maximums are here, right? I'm going to tell you not to use the maximums and the minimums. 27 inches is the minimum amount of space that you're required to have for a knee space. You can make it taller. So you don't have to make it 27 exactly. You can make it 28 inches, 29 inches if you can. And then you have to have a minimum of 8 inches at the top. It could be deeper, and 11 inches minimum at the bottom, with the 9 inches of height if you're not providing a full amount of knee space. And that's actually, oh, I didn't give you there's a 17 inches of minimum required toe clearance at the bottom. So, and I'll talk about it in a minute, but I didn't give it to you right away. This dimension, this figure, this section doesn't give me anything except the 9 inches of height. And I'll talk about the 6 inches in a minute, but the 9 inches of height that's required for the knee clearance is there. You also have 2'10", right? They didn't give me maximums or minimums. They'd make it exactly 2'10", which is 34 inches. And then if I subtract the 5 inches, then I know that they gave me 27 inches. But all these are exact numbers. So again, the 5 inches, the 2'10", all these are exactly the exact numbers. And they don't give me the 8 inches that I need. So when I get out in the field, there's no 8 inches, there's no knee clearance. So because it wasn't built, it wasn't dimensioned, therefore it wasn't built. And this is not one of your projects, so don't worry. There's a disposal. So when you have a disposal, you do have to figure out a way to make the disposal work. And some of the things that I've seen is that you use a smaller version, like I think InSinkErator has a small little profile disposal. You can also put the disposal piping in the back, towards the back instead of in the middle. You can put the plumbing in the back of the sink, and then that gives you more space to work with. But it does work. I mean, I have seen it where there are compliant drinking. Sinks with disposals. So that's something that did I answer your question? Whoever was asking. Anybody, the person who was asking me about who was that?
Jen.
Yeah,
Jen, you were asking.
Yes, sorry, I was trying to unmute. Yes.
Same here.
Yes, I was trying to screenshot it actually.
Okay, no problem. So you actually, this isn't going to be recorded and I'm going to give it to you, but that's fine. But
Awesome.
But yeah, so this is what's your question specifically about disposals?
Well, we do hotels, and a lot of the hotels that have the kitchenettes in them do have garbage disposals, and so it's just it's challenging sometimes to get the basin at a narrow depth, but then also have the garbage disposal included.
It is, but it's still
and the 2 foot maximum for the reach for the outlets on the back wall.
Right, that's the hardest part. that the reaching, and I'll talk about the reaching in a minute, because that's actually something that does come up a lot, that you're reaching too far. So yeah, so that, and then especially when you have a backsplash and then a jip wall. So yeah, we'll talk about that in a minute. But yes, it can be done. And if you need my help with figuring it out, let me know and I'll be happy to. What I wanted to show you about this figure though, this section, is the way they dimensioned it. Of course, they also dimensioned it exactly to the maximums. Remember I told you that you needed 17 inches minimum at the toe clearance. So somehow they got from a long time ago, they got the impression that 6 inches maximum for toe clearance was a construction limitation. So they would dimension it that way. And I'm going to tell you why that's a problem in a minute. First of all, 9 inches minimum of toe clearance is what the toes are required to have. And in this case, they built it at 4 inches. So that's actually not compliant for a toe clearance. But also, in addition to that, there is the 6 inches maximum is not required to be dimensioned. It's not a construction dimension. It's basically defining what is toe clearance. So they say a toe clearance is defined as the area that it takes that's 9 inches high and 6 inches maximum beyond the obstruction. That's considered toe clearance. Anything else is not considered toe clearance, but it's not limiting you how much space you can have beyond that. So my client drew this for me. He said, it's really a house for a rat, right? It's a rat's nest. So you can have airspace beyond that 6 inches and it's not incorrect. So this is why they modified their figure, and they have a break line. They don't care how far or how deep your counter is. You know, just like what Jen was saying, it has to do with reaching, right? And so, and part of reaching has to do with how far your toes can go. And then it's not considered toe clearance. And so it's only for definition purposes that you want to know that it's 6 inches maximum. So for example, in this case, a pedestal sink cannot be a compliant, an accessible lavatory because there's no toe clearance. Unless they were hovering for 9 inches, this really isn't a compliant fixture. So, you know, you have your maximums and minimums, and your 6 inches is only defined as a definition, right? It's not a limitation. So one of the things that you want to keep in mind also is that a work surface, it's not just lavatories and sinks that require this. You also have to have a non-employee work surface, which would be things like your donor booths, right? Where you're having a donor fill out forms, or you're talking to someone. They have to sit down with you and talk to them about you're doing, I'm talking about your CSL plasma projects also, because that's ones I work on you. So you have to have a toe and knee and toe clearance at those booths. And this is one of the things that I have found, not lately, but in the beginning when we were first started working together, I noticed that your contractors would build it only with 9 inches at the top of your knees, but not the whole thing was, higher than or lower than 9 inches, so that I never had my toe clearance, basically. So you have to have your minimum of 6 inches, which is 11 inches really at the bottom. And it didn't always work out that way. So you want to make sure that if that panel is going to go lower than 9 inches, that you have to have 11 inches at the top as well. So that's one of the things to keep in mind. The other thing to keep in mind when you're doing your toe clearance is also in relation to reach ranges. And there's 2 separate sections. 306 tells you how much toe clearance you can define your space as. And then your reach range, 308, tells you what you're supposed to do with that. So it says, the first sentence says, the high forward reach shall be 48 inches. Oh, well, that's okay. Where, oh, that's not what I meant to do. Sorry. So this is where you have your reach that if you have a disposal or you have an outlet, you can only reach no more than 25 inches as a forward approach. So if you have a 30-inch deep counter and you have your disposal, you know, at the 30 inches or the switch to turn it on, that's too far. So sometimes I don't get that dimension. I don't get the dimension for how far it is or how low it is, because it's either 48 inches if you're going 20 inches, or if you're going farther than 20 inches to reach, then you have to lower it to 44 inches. So keep that in mind when they're, and I know sometimes you don't have any control over those toilet accessories because it's owner installed, or owner provided. So just educate them that it's going to be a violation if they don't do it a certain way. So things like this, soap dispensers, paper towel dispensers, things like that. Okay, this is what I wanted to talk to you about. I thought it was coming next. With where you have a high reach over an obstruction, the clear floor space, including your toe clearance, shall extend the same distance as what you're reaching. Okay, so this means that if you're allowed to have between 17 and 25 inches below your sink or work surface or whatever, then that's the toe clearance you're allowed. So when they give me things like this, where I have a blocking because they thought they had to stop that toe clearance at 17 or whatever, 6 inches maximum. So then it's a problem, because if I'm reaching to the faucet, if you notice, my faucet is farther than that blocking. So what does that mean? I have a 18 inches to reach the faucet. If I'm only given 17 inches, which is what this is, then I'm not going to be able to reach that faucet because there's this blocking that's in my way. Okay, and it needs to align. It needs to be a minimum. If I have 18 inches to the faucet, but then I have 20 inches to the soap dispenser or paper towel dispenser, I need that much space underneath. So right now they gave me the range, or they said between 17 and 25 inches. And I would have been fine if everything is at 17 inches. But because my faucet is at 18 and my soap dispenser is at 20, and let's say an outlet is at 25, okay, then this isn't going to work. So that's going to be it's not going to give me the clear floor space that I need. So this is actually a figure of your, they had a baseboard underneath. And when I reached for my soap dispenser, it was like 24 inches. Let's say it's 24 inches. But my toe clearance really was only 16 inches because of that baseboard. It wasn't even 17 minimum that's required. So, but it needed to be 24 inches because my reach to my soap dispenser or whatever I'm reaching was deeper than that. So this is actually wrong for two reasons. One was that it didn't have the 17 minimum required at the floor, and it also didn't have the amount of space required for reaching. So remember that 6 inches is not a dimension that you want to put in your drawings. It's just something to define the toe clearance, which is, you know, for that purpose. You could also do a side reach, but a side reach only works if you have a 34-inch maximum height obstruction. So if I have a 36-inch high counter, and if I have a faucet, if I have a switch or an outlet that I'm reaching, a side reach, that's not going to work. I'm not going to be able to reach that because the requirement is 34 inches maximum to the obstruction. This one is a switch and an outlet that was done in, this was in a lab. So it's not in anything that, this was in a school, and it was in a lab. It was a 30-inch deep to the outlet. And that's too far. And I think the height of the counter was fine. It was 34 inches, but the reach for a side reach, you can only go 24 inches. It's a little different than the forward reach, but if you can only allowed to go 24 inches over an obstruction, this one was way, way farther than that. So you just need to find another location along that counter that it can be accessible, because I think it's only one outlet as long as they're all the same. Okay, now let's talk about protruding objects. I know I'm almost out of time, but I'll try to speed it up a little bit. Okay, a protruding object, again, a pastor, a priest, and a rabbi walk into a bar because it was a protruding object. Okay, so that's the protruding object, again, is for people who are blind, who can't see, and they detect their way by using a cane. And so the cane can only detect elements below 27 inches. So that shaded area, that's cane detectable. Okay, so that's where they're able to detect things. So anything that can project 12 inches if it needs to, below that line. Above that, you don't want to have anything that's projecting more than 4 inches, because once they don't see it, they're going to hit their head or hit their body with it. So things that are in a circulation path, like a hallway or a path to offices or whatever, objects should not be more than 4 inches into that. So TV monitors, clocks in existing conditions. Drinking fountains are notoriously, you guys are good because you put them in a recess or put little wing walls around it, so that's good. But sometimes they don't have that. So they're like in the circulation path. So those are considered a protruding object. And so what we do is we put a cane detectable apron underneath the high drinking fountain, which is normally the one that's higher than 27 inches. In this case, this is where it's better to do it exactly at 27 inches, meaning your low drinking fountain, because 27 inches is the amount of space, the amount of cane detection, and 27 inches is also the knee clearance. So if I put it right at 27 inches, in this case is the only exception that I give to like exactly 27 inches. Then you can kill two birds with one stone. So that's actually a good thing. But one of the things to keep in mind is I drew this line because the high drinking fountain doesn't require knee space. But my problem is that the clear floor space for the drinking fountain for the wheelchairs has to be centered at the drinking fountain. Not everything has to be centered. Like you're not going to see this word centered at the sinks or lavatories, for example, but you are going to see it at drinking fountains. So if you have to have the clear floor space centered at the drinking fountain, then part of your knee space is going to be under the high drinking fountain. This is why it's better not to have them side by side, because if you have this condition, then you're actually going to be below. If you put this in the high drinking fountain and it goes below 27 inches, now you're obstructing the knee clearance at the low drinking fountain. So this is something that I saw, and it was just like mind-boggling why they did this. The contractors don't understand why they need that cane detection, that apron. So they buy a cane detectable apron for every single drinking fountain, and now they took away the knee space at the low one. Plus, they didn't even need this because they had wing walls. They didn't even need the cane detectable apron. Your wing walls was your cane detection. And if you were designing it, you could fix this by design only. You didn't even need your wing walls or cane detection. If they put the low drinking fountains outside at 27 inches exactly, then that would have been the cane detection. So this was, just be careful with your contractors and explain to them where the cane detection needs to be. Things like protruding objects inside the restrooms, my circulation path to my lavatory, that's a protruding object, even though it's inside. It's not in a public circulation path like what we think of, right? That's not what the definition is. So one of the things, obviously, to fix it is we can put a permanent waste paper basket underneath the protruding object, and that becomes cane detectable. Or you can build something out. It has to be fixed and permanent for it to work. Like you can do a credenza, but it has to be permanent, a permanent credenza. Some other examples of protruding objects. This one is a one that Texas came up with as a rule. It's probably okay. The DOJ probably thinks the same way about it, but that a diaper changing counter on a closed position, let's pretend that this is 4 inches, okay? So in a closed position, it's not necessarily a protruding object, but when it's open and they leave it open, then it is. So they're thinking, oh, I'm in a hurry, I'm changing my baby, and then I leave the restroom and I leave the diaper changing counter open, then my next person is blind and comes in and doesn't detect it because it's above 27 inches and it's protruding more than 4 inches. So they essentially created a protruding object. So let's, maybe find a different way of doing locations of diaper changing counters. And the reason why I'm telling you that Texas is they created a technical memorandum, TDLR did, and said exact this. They said diaper changing counters in an open position are going to be considered protruding objects. One of the solutions is to mount it exactly at 27 when it's open. So again, just like the drinking fountain, if you're exactly at 27, you have the knee clearance and you have cane detection. Really quickly, operable parts. I won't. It's almost time, but operable parts are is the section that talks about when you're operating something that you're reaching or that you're required to operate. It should be used with one hand, not required to tightly grasp or twist the wrist or pinch to operate it, and should be no more than 5 pounds. Some of the things that I see are, it's a misunderstanding of a cut sheet. So you see this little ADA symbol and you automatically assume that it's that the operable part also works, and it doesn't. This one requires tight grasping and twisting, and it's usually more than 5 pounds. I've tried it. So things like this is better. Levers, things that you push down or you push in. This is one that I get, currently I'm getting into arguments with my designers. I don't mean to, but they're telling me this is the ASI cut sheet tells them that it's ADA compliant and it doesn't require tight grasping or pinching, and it's not true. That's the only way to work this unit, this feminine napkin dispenser, is to tightly grasp it and pull it, or pinch it and pull it, and I have not been able to use it any other way. So I don't recommend this one. This one is a better unit. This one is a new one that Bobrick actually came up with because of the other one. That was a Bobrick also. But ASI hasn't come to terms with the fact that their unit is not ADA compliant. They still argue with me about it, and every time I find it, I'm sorry to say, it's not an acceptable operable part. So things like this, for example, also require tight grasping and twisting. So it's the adjustable mechanism should also comply. So this one requires pinching and probably 2 hands to operate it. It's also one that you, for showers. So this is better. This is a lever type. This one's better also. But also keep in mind that when you're mounting it, I also have to be able to reach it. So don't mount it so that the operable part is higher than 48 inches. It also has to comply with the reach range. It's not just the operable part, but the reach range as well. One thing about rocker switches, the operable part of a rocker switch is not in the middle. So if your electrician mounts it to the middle and you try to operate it, if you push the middle, nothing's going to happen. It's either the top or the bottom. That's the operable part. So I don't think that electricians understand operable parts. So if you can put a general note or tell your electrical engineer to put a general note of where to install them so that it's the top of the operable part or the operable part, depending. One more thing to talk about, and this is important because I see it all the time. Your civil engineer tends to misunderstand curb ramps, and they think that they need to give me a maximum length or a length for the curb ramp, and it's not true. The requirement for a curb ramp is the slope cannot exceed 1 to 12. So if you have an 8-inch curb, you're going to need an 8-foot minimum length of ramp and not 6 feet. If you have an 8-inch curb and you do a 6-foot ramp, it's going to have the wrong slope. So this is where it tells you what are the requirements for a curb ramp: slope, cross slope, ground surface, width, and wet conditions The rise or the length of the ramp is not one of the requirements. So you have to educate our civil engineers so that they don't do it wrong. Grab bars, I'm not going to talk to you about. It's running out of time, but hard wall toilet compartments. Just keep in mind that if you're designing a toilet compartment without toe clearance, which means that 9-inch all the way around, or in 2 sides, technically, if you do one that's really nice and it's from floor to ceiling, you have to make the inside bigger because they don't have any way of maneuvering outside. So you, instead of 5 feet clear, it has to be 5'6", and that's the minimum. You can make it a little bit bigger. Again, no maximums and minimums. So that's for that toe clearance that they require to compart. All right, well, that's all the time I have. I mean, I could go back to the grab bars because we did have a little bit of time if you want me to, but if you guys have any questions before we close? If you want me to go back to the grab bars, I can, let me know.
Could you talk more about work area?
Yeah.
In a commercial kitchen?
Yeah.
You know, if there was like a disabled worker that was working in that kitchen,
Great question.
how would you not be discriminating?
Great question. So the ADA has 5 titles. The first title is about employment. Title 1 talks about employment. We deal with Title 3. Title 3 talks about building access. There's 2 separate things. So I'm going to give you a little bit of story. In the beginning, when the Department of Justice, when the Access Board wrote it, they did have public comments. Okay, and then they wanted everything to be compliant, including work areas, because of the same thing you just said. Well, we don't want to discriminate against people that want to work there. So they wanted everything to be compliant. And then the building owners and business owners got involved and said, we may not always have disabled people working here. So why are you making us do all this now? Let us do it when the time comes. So that's what they did. They said, all right, so Title 1 says you can't discriminate if they want to work there. And by the same token, you can't discriminate if they get disabled while you're working there. You can't fire them just because they become disabled. You now have to accommodate them. So that's where Title 3 only says approach, enter, exit. And then Title 1 says once they enter and they're disabled, you do have to accommodate them. And so you have to provide a knee clearance if they need it, or whatever else. But that's why restrooms are compliant. That's why buildings have elevators, not just later, but now. And so that's why there's the things that are hard to do were required right away. The things that are like, okay, we'll do it later. That's why it's so there. You're right. It would be discrimination, but under Title 1, not Title 3, which is what we deal with. Good question.
Thanks. That's a great answer.
Thank you. Any other questions?
Thanks so much for this presentation. This was great.
You're welcome. Very good. So yeah.
I have another question. Going back to the knee and toe clearance, on a recent ADA report that we got, they came back and said that pedestal style tables, like 2-top tables, are not ADA compliant.
Well, tell me about the table. Is the table fixed table or is it a furniture?
No, it's a piece of furniture with a pedestal in the middle, and so it's like a 24 by 30 inch tabletop.
Okay, so
with the pole in the middle.
That's a great question. Furniture, first of all, furniture is not required to comply. Only fixed tables. But let's pretend that you had a fixed table, okay, that had a pedestal in the middle. So that's where I'm going to answer you, because I'm not going to. The fact that it was a movable piece of furniture makes it not have to comply. It's not scoped.
Well, there's a seating requirement for like a breakfast area.
I know, but
right?
that's what I'm saying. That furniture doesn't count. That's what in your hotels. I'm assuming you're talking about hotel again.
Yep.
So if you have furniture, that doesn't count. If you have fixed counters, then you have to provide 5% of your fixed counters as compliant. And if one of your fixed counters happens to be a table, you have to make it a fixed table. So that's one thing that you have to keep in mind. ADA doesn't recognize furniture. So hang on, let me stop sharing for a second, because I want to show you a picture that I didn't, and I'm going to go to my other images, or my other pictures on. I'm going to share that with you. 1 second. Okay, images, and I'm going to talk about fixed counters. Actually, dining. I'm going to look at dining. Dining, where are you? There it is, dining. Okay, let's see. Okay, so I'm going to share. Let me see if I can share this. Share my screen. Okay, I'm gonna share my screen. Can you see that?
Yes.
Okay, so these, okay, so that's not the one I wanted to show you, but dining surfaces. This is also not something you're talking about, but let's say it is, okay? So let's say you have a dining surface that is got a pedestal in the middle. I think then my next one actually shows that. 1 second. This one was one of them. Okay, so this is a fixed, I mean, this is not a fixed table. This was just a table, and you had, say you have a pedestal right here, right? First of all, this one has a change in level. So if I forget the fact that this probably was 30 inches, so that was okay. But let's pretend that this is my approach to have a seat. So from the pedestal to the edge, I have to have a minimum of 17 inches for me to have my toe clearance work. So that's where your pedestal in the middle may not work, because if it's preventing a person from scooting into the table, let's say you have your pedestal and you have 24 inches next to it, and so the person has to scoot on the side of the pedestal, and then I only have this much space for my plate when everybody else has the whole table. So that's where it becomes a problem. You have to have a minimum of 17 inches from an obstruction to your edge of your counter. Does that make sense?
It does, but like, I guess my kind of argument in this, because we ended up having to replace the tables in both our pool area and our breakfast area to provide a single ADA like seat.
Right.
But I guess the part that I was having a hard time with is sort of the common sense side of it, that if there's a pole, that's it's not a continuous obstruction. So,
but
in theory, that pole, like your legs could go on either side, and then the same thing with the toe clearance of the actual base of the pedestal.
That's not true. Okay, so that's exactly okay. So look at let me say, this is one thing I don't like about Zoom, is that I can't share. I can't share everything. Hang on 1 second. I'm gonna go back to my presentation, and I'm gonna show you my friend Carrie. Okay, so here's my friend Carrie. Can you see that? Okay.
Yep.
Current slide. So sorry. Oh, I meant the current slide. I guess hang on a second. Sorry. So let me go back to my friend Carrie. Where are you? Sorry, guys. So my friend Carrie, and why can't I, current slide, there. So he can't move his legs to straddle the pole. He's that, yeah, his legs, I can make my legs wide and avoid that pole. He's got no movement in his legs. He's got no way of moving his legs over. So you have to assume that he's got absolutely no use of his legs, which they don't, and they're next to each other. And so when they're moving forward, the only way that they can make that work is for them to completely be on the side of the pole and the post. And so they can't straddle. They can't.
Okay, that makes sense.
See, that's where we misunderstand. It's like, I can straddle, sure. I mean, it's uncomfortable, but I can straddle, but they can't. They can't move their legs apart. And so that's where a post in the middle is not going to work. So that's why legs in four corners would work better, because you have 30 inches of clear width between, so they can just scoot under. But again, look and say, these are fixed elements are the ones that comply. I mean, I know that they don't follow, like if you were doing, for example, one in Texas, if you were doing a hotel in Texas and you gave a fixed counter at the bar or a fixed counter along the wall or something. And then you gave me a ADA table, a furniture, piece of furniture, that would have been a violation because you have to have a fixed counter or a fixed table for it to be equal. So piece of furniture goes away. Like if I decide I don't want furniture anymore because it's COVID, I'm only going to have 2 tables and that's it. And there's nothing else for me. So it's gone, right? So so that furniture is not counted as the accessible seat. Anyway, so that wasn't your question, but that's why the post needs to not be there also. So any other questions?
Again,
Yes? Yes, are we good?
just saying thank you again for.
Thank you. You're welcome. Thank you so much.
driving back to work today.
I appreciate your time and I appreciate your working together and making this a more accessible place to live, accessible world. So if you need me, you guys know where to find me. Here's my website, my email, and you can always call me with questions. So let me know and thank you so much. And I'm gonna stop recording now.
Thank you, Marcella.
You're welcome. My pleasure. Hang on, let me stop recording.